Well, we're going to be doing Zechariah still, so if you want to go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Zechariah, we're going to be in chapter 12 this evening. And we're getting to some really exciting messianic pictures as we go into this. And I wanted to remind us, that the name Zechariah means God remembers. And this is a time period when the people of Judah have come back and have started that rebuilding process. And they were very discouraged. There was a lot of things happening. Haggai, Nehemiah, and others were trying to encourage them to get the temple built and trying to restore it to the glory that Solomon had wasn't going to happen in the physical way. So there's a lot of this that's going on. And so the first part of that book, we saw where he is encouraging them through these visions and such. But then he shifted, and when he comes out of those visions, starts to give very specific messages. And the first one is dealing with them and their relationship with God and the relationship that they had as they were in captivity. And while they were in captivity, they had some feast days. They had some rituals that they had developed. And so they come and they ask Zechariah, do we continue these fast days? And God turns it around on them and kind of points out that those were ritualistic and that those were why? Why were you doing those? And it was because they were in a broken covenant relationship at that time, and they were in punishment. So now they're out. And so he says, we're going to turn those into feast days. And so, but he talks about in chapter 11, the fall. Remember, historically, 520 or 520 years from when Christ is coming. Now, it seems like a huge amount of time. But if you start from creation, when God declared his promise to Eve and to mankind, that he's going to restore this relationship, it's, been over 4,000 years. So 500 years is a pretty short time in how all this is going to happen. And historically, some amazing things were going to happen. From 520, when Zechariah is writing this, we're going to see the time period where that the Greek nation, through Alexander the Great, was going to rise up, storm across, build this amazing empire, and then suddenly divide and just collapse, dividing up into providences or kingdoms. And one of them was the Seleucid, and then the Ptolemy, Egyptian area, and the Syrian area. And then the Seleucian kingdom, Antiochus, is going to be one of the kings that comes along. And then Antiochus Epiphanes is the one key one that's going to come up in the future and really impose his hatred against the Jewish religion and going to impose a lot of the Greek culture on them, which they were fighting. And this Hellenistic conversion, this struggle that the Jews, after they've come out of this captivity, rebuilt the temple, they're trying to serve God right. Now they're going to have a confrontation, and this is part of what was depicted in the first chapters, 9, 10, and then how that they were going to rise up. This is called, in the historical Jewish histories, the Maccabean Revolt. And in that Maccabean Revolt, they were going to be successful, and God was going to protect them, and they were showing their loyalty to try to maintain the sacrifices and the obedience to the Mosaic law. And the shepherds at that time were going to be good, but that was going to change. And then during that, we find that they made this contact rudimentarily with Rome, and that Rome was going to be eventually the next nation, which was also, these were all prophesied, line up with what Daniel had prophesied about in his visions as well. So that Roman history is going to come into play during the next 500 years. And then with Rome coming along, then they're going to merge the leadership again. There's going to be this cultural melding in order to protect the culture of the Jewish leadership. They were going to compromise themselves, and they're going to submit themselves to this new king, the emperor. And that it comes to a head when you see the way that they acted whenever the Messiah actually showed up, the one true shepherd. And so he's dealing with 4 through 14 about the shepherd and the flock, the people, the leadership, and those that were in Jerusalem, and how that they were being taken advantage of through this compromised relationship with Rome. And that's a real deep political side that sometimes, we don't dig into and see. We see the effect of it and the way that they interacted with the Romans when Jesus comes, and the way that they had that. They developed like a symbiotic, a relationship that was necessary, because we looked at how that when they were confronted with the threat from Jesus and their position, they were afraid that because Jesus was going to be considered a rebel, and boy, the Romans, oh man, there's a couple of things. If you want to get the Romans fired up and get on you, don't pay your tribute and say you got a rebellion. Those are two things that were like fire alarm. We're coming in. We're going to fix it. So whoever the local government was throughout the empire were entrusted in this relationship to maintain peace and order and collect taxes and pay it to the emperor. So that's what they were really afraid of. They had become comfortable. They were compromised. The priesthood itself had been compromised. The Roman local governor didn't like the high priest that should have been serving when Jesus came. And so you had two high priests, Caiaphas and Ananias. And that wasn't right. So that was a shadow. If you read that and you understood, you go, wait a minute, there's something wrong. But the statement they said about Jesus as a threat said it all, because they very boldly say, what are we going to do with this guy? Because what's he going to do? He's threatening our position. And the Romans will come and take our nation away. The Romans? What? You're not worried about God? So you see then what he talks about is how worthless they were and how corrupt they were. But the last part of that, when he talks about the worthless shepherd, is not in the sense of those shepherds. I want to kind of clarify this in the sense that this shepherd that Zechariah is called to play this role in, and he tells him, now go and be a shepherd to a flock of slaughter. And talking about the worthlessness of this shepherd is not that he's no good. It's just that that's the way everyone was viewing him. And that's when we saw the 30 pieces of silver. When the shepherd said, hey, which is Jesus saying, pay me what I'm worth. What am I worth to you as the Messiah? And I'm saying it in modern terms, and this is the prophet was saying, pay me my wages. Zechariah said it that way. And the people basically said, here, you're worth 30 pieces of silver. And we know historically, 500 and plus years later, that's exactly what the price of him is going to be given. And that was the price of a slave. So it was very, very demeaning. And so that's what he's reflecting. And so, but we're still talking historically. And this is where when we talk about the prophets, is not to fracture and pull things and establish one story and then grab another portion of the scripture and group it and then restart the story about something else. And then when he keeps going in the next chapter, grab that and grab it. Because this writer, who Zechariah was a writer, did not divide his book up into these chapters. Why I say that is because modern writers do that. They will start a new chapter with a whole new basic theme for that chapter. And we're used to that. I listen to audiobooks, and a lot of times they'll say chapter 14, the donkey and the goat. And then it'll go and talk about the next chapter, and it'll talk about, and then the donkey and the goat will come up. And so we have this way of sometimes doing some violence to the text in the Bible, because when the chapters change, doesn't mean that what the topic has changed. And this is what we have between 11 and 12 and even into 13. We're still talking about kind of a historical perspective that Zechariah is revealing, and this idea of the Messiah coming. And we've already talked about the history side of the nations and things that were happening that they could then take and go back to the other prophets and go, there's those nations right there. So we're not stopping and changing. And so there's some of these words. We actually kind of talked about it in our class on Wednesday night about some of the terminology, and we're going to get into that tonight. And so tonight, he's going to talk about this and continue it, but a lot of it is, again, about recognizing and showing the Messiah, this prophesied king that they're looking for. Now, they're still listening and thinking of a physical king that was going to be born, raise up, and be a David. that was going to be able to overthrow and reestablish and have this prosperous nation that would be, just like when David, that's the gold standard to them. To the Jew, it was the King David, not even Solomon. Solomon even though in all his glory, but it was David who united the tribes. He's the one that built and established the city of Jerusalem, Zion. He is the one who conquered and defeated and put into submission all the enemies around. He expanded the border to the largest extent. Solomon did a little bit. He expanded to the north a little bit of territory, but it was David. And so then we know that after Solomon, the tribes split into two different kingdoms. So the gold standard for the Jew was David. So they're looking at it very physically, thinking this king's coming. And so as he's trying to show through this, so this is a part of the chapters that we're looking at are still connecting, showing the history, what's going to be happening, and the relationship of the leaderships through the revolt of the Maccabees, through the occupation of the Romans coming in, and then all of a sudden that relationship that where the shepherds, the leadership of the Jews are going to become so compromised and in a relationship with the Romans that when the David, the Messiah, does show up, they reject him. And now we're going to see God's response. But we also are going to see their response. And so he will start out in the first 3 verses calling it the burden or the oracle. And we'll discuss that in the first. And then he lays out this divine protection for Jerusalem. Now, when you hear this again, it starts to come back to the literal. And this is where you have to be careful. Some people who already have an idea of what's going to happen in the end of the world have reverse engineered their theory to make the prophets, like Zechariah here, fit their definition of the end. The millennial reign, the new kingdom, the Jerusalem is going to rule. And if you have that already in your mind, then Zechariah means something completely different to you. That's the problem. That when I read other scholars and some people who already have preconceived ideas and establish their doctrine around a certain end times, when God's coming, when he's returning, it just changed the way then they start talking about Zechariah. But Zechariah, it is much more simple, even though when you and I are reading the language, it seems very complex. So this divine protection for Jerusalem is not the physical city, but he's talking about the events that are going to occur, what's going to be happening when the Messiah comes. And we know that Jerusalem is referred to as God's city, the city of Zion. We know that the writer of Hebrews brings out that we are no longer a part of this physical world, this terror like mounts, Sinai, where the mountains shook and the people were fearful. He goes, no, we have come to the new Jerusalem. And this is what I want you to see is this is what he's talking about, is this new Jerusalem. And then he'll talk about he uses these key words that help to open it up, just kind of like shatter it open. Because that's what caught me as you start reading it and you go, wait a minute, the one pierced, I know who he is. 30 pieces of silver, I know who he is. And then when you look, he keeps saying this phrase, on that day, on that day, on that day. Now, when I read Jeremiah 31:31, that's talking honestly about on that day, he will have a new covenant. And you notice that when I read in Jeremiah, he talked about after these days. So historically, as we read Zechariah, up until the time that he comes, that is these days in which they're living in that. But there's that day coming. And this is the whole thing. 7 times in chapter 12, he says, on that day. So I want you to keep that in your mind. As lost as you might kind of get, there's words like the one they pierced, this grieving, this idea of Jerusalem. I want you to shape that definition around the spiritual and that the children of Israel, who are they? They are those of the faith of Abraham. Not all that were genealogically linked to him. We know that by Paul. So those who have the faith as Abraham, who are going to be who? The Christians. So the Christians are a part of this Jerusalem, this Israel, when he uses these words. And so let's jump in and talk about that burden, because it really sets it. It's almost like he's already talked about the shepherds coming and the worthlessness that they're going to treat him as. And it's like then all of a sudden God's, through Zechariah, says he's bringing forward this powerful punctuation in this burden or oracle, as ESV says. The oracle of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. So who's God? You see what God says about himself? Is there anybody better? Any more qualified? Anybody? No, you get it? God is saying. This is concerning Israel. And he says, I am the creator and have established everything. I put the spirit within all of you. And I formed the earth, put the spirit of man in. And then he comes, so he's described himself. And then he says, behold, I'm about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. And on that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. Who will lift it will surely hurt themselves. And all the nations of the earth will gather against it. The first part, when we back up, when he says this, he says, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering. Okay, so what do we understand? There is a word in there that we are kind of familiar with as Christians, is a cup. A cup of what? We know the Lord uses this, and so we see that one of the most telling ones I remember is two brothers who their mom came to Jesus and said, well, we would like you to put one son on the right hand of you when you're ruling and one on the left hand. And Jesus said in Mark 10:38, Jesus said to them, do you know what you are asking? Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism which I am baptized? So he's talking about something else. A cup, though, still very symbolic. God uses this a lot. And then we see at the Lord's Supper, Luke 22:20, this is not what Jesus was saying. Are you going to be able to drink this? We'll get to that. But he says, and likewise, the cup after they had eaten, and he said, this cup is poured out for you, is the new covenant. Remember Jeremiah 31:31? Jeremiah 31:31 said, the old covenant's gone. They broke it. There's a new covenant that's coming. You notice Jeremiah also said, it's not going to be a covenant that where you're going to teach your neighbor one another. You know what that meant? It wasn't going to be a theocracy, a government religion, a religious government. It was going to be something different instead of being instructed. So like if your neighbor got up and he didn't go to church and he walked too far down or he did some work, you could get him for breaking the Sabbath. You know, hey neighbor, you can't do that. You can't walk your ox too far down the road here. You can't. It was no. And where was it going to be? It was no more going to be this external, ritualistic, legalistic form of Mosaic law, but it's going to be one that was going to be internal. It's going to be a spiritual one that is going to say, and in Hebrews, who is also quoting from Jeremiah 31:31, said it's going to be written on their hearts. That's where it was going to be. And that's part of this new covenant. And that's what Jesus is talking about when he says this cup. But then later, when Jesus is in the garden, you remember something he says as well in Luke 22:42, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, your will be done. That was the cup of wrath. That's the cup of staggering. Not only did Jesus endure it for those who are going to have faith in him, but by those who had faith in him that were going to be righteous with him and right with him, the others were going to receive the wrath also of a cup. And this is another word, John records in 18:11. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into your sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? So let's come back to our text. When he says a cup of staggering, that he says, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering. So Jerusalem, in a sense, is the substance in the cup, and that it was going to have an effect on those around. So now when we come and think about what happened when they rejected the Messiah and what the effect that it was going to have, especially long-term historically, we see the effects of eventual destruction of Jerusalem. We see the effect that it had on all the nations around, no matter how much they tried to rage against the Christians and kill them. What happened to them? Where are they today? Where are all those nations? They don't exist. Where is Christ's kingdom? It is still here. And that fits what Daniel said when he prophesied about all those four kingdoms that were coming, that this last kingdom that was coming was one that was going to be from God. It was going to be a spiritual kingdom, and that would not be passed down like the king's bloodline, that this would be one that would be a spiritual one and would last forever and ever. And this is what's going to happen. All the nations, as they try to come up against Jerusalem, remember the heavenly Jerusalem and all the citizens who are Christians in this, that as they come against us, ain't going to work. Ain't going to work. It's going to backfire on them. And no matter how much they try to come up against them. Now, he had talked historically about the siege, but this is one that is going to be against God's people. Now, Jerusalem and Judah, if you think about it, one is a city, the other is the area. So you have the urban and the rural. So that is the effect. So in other words, it's going to be all, no matter where that they are at, that this is going to have this power and that he is going to be with them. The heavy stone for all the peoples. You know, this is something where we know a lot about the cornerstone and the rejection of that cornerstone. And so when we see that, I want to bring that up because one of the things is that he is talking about this stone and that this is the very stone. And Jesus says to the Pharisees, basically, that those who come up against it are going to basically be crushed. And so the Pharisees, even in that encounter, talk about the idea that he was talking about them. They understood the prophets as well, that anyone who comes up against it, that they were going to be destroyed. And so this is what he's talking about. So he starts to then, in 4 and 9, talk about this divine protection. And really, this is a divine protection for God's people. Using the word Jerusalem, though. And on that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness. But for the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eyes open. When I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness, and the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts, their gods. Horses are referred to many times as not only just powerful, but they're also instruments of war. And that was interesting because historically, God had always prohibited the Israelites from having horses and having chariots because he was the one that was their protection, and that he said, I don't want you to have these because you don't need them. I am the one. So whenever all these horses and these chariots come up and attack you, I'm gonna shake them off. And that's kind of this Hebrewic way of showing something they should have understood from Mosaic law about the idea of putting trust in God. Don't worry about the warfare, instruments of warfare that these foreign nations can bring upon you, because God will destroy the horses. He will take over, overthrow the chariot. Don't worry about them. And so there's kind of this idea about God is also going to strike them. And there's something also beautiful about this, him saying he's keeping his eyes open. You know, there are times where God would look away. And he mentioned that earlier whenever he just is going to give up the Jerusalem and the temple, and the Romans in 70 AD were going to come in and totally annihilate the place. and just be barbaric. And God said, I'm not going to look. I'm not going to, I'm going to break the foundational covenant of protection. And that's something that he did always maintain with them, no matter how much he was punishing them and armies would come in and he would be disciplining them. He was not allowing those nations to inflict their worst on them. Even though if you were on the receiving end of it, like your father's belt, you would be going, I got the worst of it. But God has always said, no. I'm watching. I'm going to discipline you, but there's a boundary to it. But earlier in Zechariah, he basically has said, I'm going to look away. And whatever happens is going to happen. And no matter what level of barbaric infliction of pain and suffering that they bring upon, I'm going to let it happen. And even to the point, remember we talked about him saying, even them eating their own flesh and this cannibalism, and that did occur during the siege of Jerusalem. Now we're looking at the opposite. So this is what I mean about, this would be a very conflicted passage, these chapters. If you look at that, what we just described about how he was going to turn his eyes away from this Jerusalem, and then all of a sudden now we have this Jerusalem that he's making powerful. So it's like, okay, well, what exactly is it? So that's where he has shifted though, because he's brought in that shepherd in chapter 13, which is the Messiah. And so now he has shifted and showing that his eyes now are looking towards this new Jerusalem, this new relationship, these new Christians, and that after they've rejected the Messiah and those shepherds that he could not put up with anymore have been destroyed, we come into 14, and now he is showing this new Jerusalem, this new relationship where he will not take his eyes off his people. That's us. Isn't that exciting? That's us. And if you look historically, no matter how much the nations have ever raged against Christians. Now you say, well, I don't know, Ron, they have murdered a lot of Christians. But you know what? Christianity is still around. His kingdom is still existent. And all they did in a lot of ways was do God a favor and the people of his kingdom a favor by taking them home. Now it sounds weird. You go, wow, that's kind of weird. But no. That's the dimension of this powerful nation in which we are a part of, is that you can do whatever you want to this body, but I am still with God. I am still in this kingdom. You can do nothing to separate me from this eternal blessing that I have by being a part of this kingdom. And so that's why he is showing this. And that's why there's going to reach a point, he says that the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, we have this strength. And where does it come from? It comes from God. And on that day, I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of the wood, a flaming torch among sheaves, and they shall devour to the right and to the left, and all the frowning peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem, in the right place with God. So, you have to really, I guess if we were living in that day and age and we understood, and you ever cooked a lot with wood, hot pots, things like this, if you ever took a cast iron skillet or a pot and it became enraging hot and you took that and set it off into a stack of grass, what would happen? Everything around it could catch on fire and burn. And so the image here is like the same, that God is going to make his new nation, this Jerusalem, this pot that is so hot that anyone who comes against it is going to be like dashing themselves against a stone, against the Messiah, but also the pot is going to burn and there's going to be nothing. And so he's giving this comfort through this protection that he's going to provide for them. And the Lord shall give salvation to the tents of the Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass that of Judah. And on that day the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them on that day shall be like David, and the house of David shall be like God, and the angel of the Lord going before them. And on that day, I will seek to destroy all the nations that have come against Jerusalem. So through this blessing, through this Messiah, the shepherd in whom they have sold out, They're basically going to receive this blessing, this salvation that's going to come to Judah first. And when he talks about this relationship, when he says, glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass that of Judah, there's an equality there. There's this equality, and this is something that we have that no other people in any nation that has ever existed physically or with God has had this type of equality with Christ in this inheritance that we have accomplished. It is so powerful and beautiful. And he is the one on that day protect us. So this is a day that's coming over 500 years when this Messiah finally does arrive. And the angel of the Lord going before them, sound familiar? That sounds exactly like the Exodus, where the angel of the Lord did what? As he brought them out, he was leading them. He was ahead of them. So this is that beautiful picture. And any enemies will not survive if they try to attack. And then he moves to talking about the one that was pierced. That word again, that where you should perk up even if you're not fully familiar with prophetic language, because that's something that we do know that in the New Testament Gospels and the New Testament writers point out very clearly that this is the Messiah, the one whom they pierced, who they did pierce the Lord with a Roman sword, a spear, while he was hanging on the cross. And so this is the vision that now he's going to relate to on that day. Remember? So we're not talking about a whole separate time and space. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him, as one who weeps over the firstborn. On that day, the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadon Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. So this looks right directly. We can pull this right from Acts 2:37, that as the apostles stood up and they were proclaiming the gospel message, one of the things that happened that we see in verse 37 is that when they heard this, they were cut to the heart. And they said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? And this is not me. This is what most of the Hebrew scholars who believe in these writings and such point and link very powerfully to, is this grief that once the realization of people realizing what they had done and that they pierced him and that they look upon this image of the prophets had the Messiah right in front of them. And what did they do? They treated him like a cheap shepherd for 30 pieces of silver, and they turned around and crucified him and pierced him on the cross. Jeremiah 31, this is the same chapter, in Jeremiah 31:31, in referencing to this new covenant and such. He writes, and with weeping they shall come, and with pleas of mercy I will lead them back. I will make them walk by the brooks of water, in a straight path in which they shall not stumble. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. And it's a beautiful picture of exactly tying in what Zechariah is showing, and also what we see in the restoration through repentance and accepting Jesus Christ as their Savior, their Messiah, that God brought this blessing upon them. And so that is something. Another reference that's over in Revelation 1:7 about that Jesus is the one who is pierced in Revelation 1:7. And John writes, behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, amen. So, like I said, these are very connected to the Messiah coming and all the events that are going to happen that we see were recorded in the gospel and fitting perfectly in with what God has already accomplished. So, and that's why Zechariah is an amazing book. And then he says, the land shall mourn. This fits what we've been talking about. Each family. Now, this is an interesting description, the way he talks about the depth of mourning, how mournful was somebody when their loved one died? You think about that? A little bit, a lot? But so this is an interesting Hebrewic way of showing the depth, the effect of this mourning. And the land shall mourn. Oh, let me back up because I overran this one. He says, on that day of mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. This is when Josiah, young King Josiah, died. And he was riding on his chariot, and he tried to go out and intercede. Pharaoh Necho was heading north and going out to aid the Babylonians. And he decides to go out and to try to stop Pharaoh Necho. And it's an interesting conversation because Pharaoh Necho sends a message to him. He goes, why are you trying to intercede? Because your God is the one that told me to hurry up and go up there and do this. And for some reason, Josiah, who was very beloved and very powerful in his restoration of the Jewish people and their faith and looked up to, very righteous young man, he goes out and he gets killed on the battlefield, and they move him into a chariot, and this is in Megiddo. And when he arrives back into the city of Jerusalem, his body, there's a tremendous mourning. They said his mourning and the weeping that went on in Jerusalem was the greatest over any king that they'd ever had. And so this is that reflection of that would be a day that if you're listening to this letter, you would know, wow, we know that was a terrible day for my ancestors, that when Josiah was killed. Jeremiah writes about it, and he himself wrote laments towards the grieving that he himself, even Jeremiah, had over the death of this young righteous king who was killed. So that's one of the references. That's how deep we're talking. And so he keeps going about this grieving over the killing of this Messiah. The land shall mourn, each family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by itself, their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Levi by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the Shimeites by itself, and their wives by themselves, and all the families that are left, each by itself, and their wives by itself. Now, so if we look at this, he's describing each family. So he's talking about the king, and when he says David and then Nathan, he's not talking about a prophet. He's probably talking about his youngest son. So we're talking about from the oldest to the youngest, kind of the whole family, in a sense, is affected. Now, the way that they worship, women did worship separate from the men. And so this is including the way that this process of grieving, the effect of it. Well, he says Levi. Levi was the tribe of the priests. The head priest comes from Levi. The last one of this is listed in the genealogy and Numbers we find is Shimei. He was the last one in the genealogical reading there. So we see, in other words, it's kind of like from Levi, the main father, all the way down to his last son, direct son that he's talking about. So it's an all-encompassing type of a grieving, kind of a strange way, but it's kind of also kind of a beautiful way of showing this. So that's the chapter. Next week we'll jump into 13. It kind of does keep going on, and we'll look at this idea of the house of David some more, and the cleansing of sin and things like this, and idolatry being cut off, and some ideas around that. So if you're with us this evening and we can assist you in your relationship with God, and there's any way that we can help you in becoming a Christian, or if you need the prayers of the church, we're going to be singing a song of invitation. And then if you're comfortable, you can come forward while we stand and we sing.